Hello, and welcome back to the Rum Ration Podcast, the only podcast where we're happy to give you the rum around.
You've been working
I'm
on that all
Rejoy.
week, haven't you?
I've been practicing that, I have to admit. So I'm Rejoy, and you are, of course, Colin. And today we're going to have a very interesting episode. I think one that we're both quite excited to do. It's about our regiment, the Royal
It is.
Montreal Regiment, and their experiences in the First World War. And they're emblematic of basically the experiences of many Canadian regiments that went into the line in the First World War, right? But of course, for us, this holds a special place in our heart because it is our regiment after all. So, Colin, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, clearly
The
we're
RMR's
biased,
experiences.
obviously. Oh, yeah, I didn't have time to grab my coffee mug. But clearly we're biased, being ex-Royal Montreal Regiment officers ourselves. However, to back up our claim as to why the RMR is being chosen as such a symbol or an emblem of all the 1st Canadian Division, Canadian Expeditionary Force units, is that the RMR was actually bilingual. We had troops all the way, we had various militia regiments who contributed troops from the Halifax Rifles, the Princess Louise Fusiliers, the Canadian Grenadier Guards, the 65e Carabiniers de Montréal, who provided close to 300 soldiers, and that's where the French-Canadian nature says. So I think the RMR is pretty unique in its ability to tell the story of all of Canada that went to war. So today we're going to be starting the first of a two-part series titled Into the Trenches, focusing on the journey of the RMR and all the Canadians as they left their training camps in the UK and made their way to the Western Front. It's a tale of preparation, endurance, logistics, all that exciting stuff, counting socks, the complexities of wartime movement, and a big, big thanks to former Captain Hamilton Slessor and his wife Jane for their incredible efforts in producing This Day in RMR History, which covered the first year of the RMR's existence, and their rich research and detailed footnoted references that Jane and Hamilton put together have really provided the bulk of the information for this episode and many more to come. Check it out on rumration.ca. We'll provide a link, and a big thanks to Hamilton and Jane. And Rejoy, you may not know this, but the connection that Hamilton has with the regiment goes back right to the 14th Battalion. His dad served as a subaltern in 1917 as part of the 14th Battalion. And his dad later went on to command the regiment and led the regiment overseas in 1939 in December as part of the first contingent of Canadians that went over in World War II. So quite the connection. And Ham himself served in the regiment in the 50s and 60s and is a very detailed researcher and provides a ton of material for us.
Amazing. That's quite a storied history there in of its own. And I went through the notes that you provided as well. Quite interesting. I mean, that's absolutely filled with all sorts of interesting information and gives you a real feeling for what they sort of went through in so many respects. And in this episode, we're going to be covering a lot of ground, aren't we? It's everything leading up to their arrival in the trenches, the travel time, training, the marches, the equipment, the weather, daily life, even the idea of before entering combat, how death was all around them. And one of the most poignant stories, I think, that we'll sort of cover a little bit is the tragic loss of Gunner William John Ball, who never even actually made it into combat, but was killed before they landed in France. So why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, Gunner Ball, that you'll talk about later, is we'll call it a workplace accident. And unfortunately, when you're moving that kind of that sheer volume of men and material and horses around, things are going to happen. So, yeah. So by early 1915, the RMR, along with the rest of the 1st Division of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, had been training vigorously on Salisbury Plain in the UK since they arrived in the UK in early October, mid-October. Conditions were challenging, to say the least. The British Army scrambled to find enough tentage for them and to find enough resources to put them up. They had to deal with really harsh weather. It was a cold winter. There was a ton of rain, a lot of floods. Some of the pictures are incredible that the troops had to go through. They were literally waiting between tents. There was an outbreak of meningitis, which killed several RMRs and about 200 Canadians all told. There was demanding schedules for training, and obviously limited resources. So to try and get somewhere to go to the firing range or to practice digging trenches, they had to march great distances through tons of mud. It's really hard to underscore just how much it sucked, living in
Mm,
canvas tents that are set up on grass and mud. So there was no proper floors on them. It was constantly cold, driving rain, and no wonder they were keen to get out of there and get to the front.
absolutely. And Salisbury Plain, to be fair, is not exactly a destination of choice in the best of weather.
I've not seen
Uh,
a Club Med being set up there.
no, no,
Not
no,
yet.
no. They couldn't get the financing for some strange reason. Uh, Training wasn't much fun either, especially in those conditions. And on, on, on a place like Salisbury, Salisbury Plain, but included things like, very interestingly enough, bayonet drills, which we covered in an earlier episode, trench construction, which was very important and would play a major role in the war, of course, and live fire exercises, which for many soldiers, it was their first experience of live fire exercises. And one has to remember also that a lot of these guys were volunteers and, of course, got the pre-war militia. Um, it's been a long time since anyone's been deployed anywhere, so facing real danger. So that you're getting into all the various aspects of that's
Excellent. Making his
that's my
appearance.
edit. That's my editor. Uh,
I think he's trying to point out to the Canadians that last been in action in the Boer War, but 15 years
that's
prior, which
exactly
was,
what he's
I
saying.
think
Yes,
I think
indeed.
that was a historical oversight on your part, and you wanted to correct that.
Yes, thank you for that. I appreciate it. But one of the things that gave them a big morale boost was when King George V reviewed the troops, the First Division, and that also gave, when you're going through training and you think to yourself, "Oh, another day of training, another day of training. When are we getting deployed?" But then the King comes and reviews you. You begin to get a feeling that like it's soon now, and it's really important what our mission is.
Yeah, probably a very early indication that they're sending you somewhere important. And it's important to regard their weapons because a lot has been talked about Canadian weapons. And the RMR was equipped, like all the Canadians were, with the Ross rifle at the time, which was a Canadian made rifle. That performed very well in marksmanship, is one of the best in the world at the time. Won countless marksmanship competitions internationally, including Bisley, and was well regarded as a hunting rifle. But it would later prove quite problematic in the harsh conditions of trench warfare. We'll probably end up doing an episode just about the Ross rifle, given how
Hmm.
important it is to Canadian military mythology and history. And the Canadian Expeditionary Force didn't officially switch over to the Lee Enfield until June 1915, but a lot of the troops, as soon as they had an opportunity, they dumped their Ross rifle and picked up a Lee Enfield to replace it with, because the Lee Enfield would be able to handle rapid fire and in the mud a lot. It wouldn't jam compared to the Ross rifle. But it must be noted that the much maligned Ross rifle was used by Canadian snipers throughout the entire war, including the greatest sniper in all of the First World War, who registered the highest number of kills
Yes,
on both sides, which was Corporal Francis Pegamabo, who was an Indigenous Canadian who recorded an incredible 378 kills. We should probably do an episode on sniping and probably about Corporal Francis Pegamabo as well.
that would be absolutely fascinating. Yes, he unbelievable on using the Ross rifle. Um,
And he killed 378. He also captured another 300. This guy he was a one-man battalion.
Well, there you go. And in terms of uniforms, of course, in those days, the khaki field dress was made of wool, which soaked up a lot of water, and there was a lot of water uh, throughout the war. That's one of the things everyone talked about, and there are pictures, especially from 1915, of wading through those waterlogged trenches. But at least the wool, well, it kept you warm. It might be wet, but it kept you warm. And you got to imagine that each infantryman carried approximately 60 pounds of gear. So that includes the Ross rifle, the ammunition, entrenching tools, spare clothing, of course, rations, and your personal items, right? So, and now for the second part, the journey begins. So they're trained, they're ready to go. They've been
The king
reviewed
has
by the
come by
king.
to say goodbye.
Yes, he has. They've been kitted out with their uniforms and everything. They're ready to go. What happens next?
Well, they got their warning orders, ready to move now. And in February 1915, the Armagh received orders to mobilize for France. And the first leg of their journey involved the 1,066 men and officers and the 66 officers of the Armagh marching to Amesbury Station, which is only about 13 kilometers away. And there they entrained for the Avonmouth Dock near Bristol. I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. I'm sure there's some Brits who are rolling their eyes at my pronunciations of how they say things. But let's be clear, this wasn't just the 1,000 men of the RMR heading out. This was the entire first division of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, which consisted originally of a cavalry squadron, a cyclist company, 4 infantry brigades, although only 3 would deploy because the 4th Brigade was broken up in January 1915. There were 3 artillery brigades, which we would consider artillery regiments now, given the size of them, divisional engineers, and supporting troops of both the Canadian Army Service Corps and the Canadian Army Medical Corps. And the strength of the 1st Division was placed at 17,873 all ranks, with 4,943 horses. A big movement of men and materiel. And if I do my math correctly, it's approximately 5 dudes for every horse. That's a fair amount of horses.
Indeed. And my editor, who was just yelling in the background again, wanted to point out that the role of animals was very important in the First World War.
That's why I inserted that part, and I thought it'd be
Yes.
important to stress that. Yes.
Point taken. And and the mode of travel wasn't very comfortable, was it? We're not talking flying first class at all. Space very constrained. The train journey was anything but comfortable. Soldiers were packed into standard troop transports. And again, remember, you're talking about 1914, 1915. So trains in those days were quite different from what they are today. And very cramped space. I mean, given the numbers that you just told us about, Colin, and I mean, we're talking about thousands of men packed into small cars. It was anything but a day trip, But spirits were high, weren't they? And this is where a lot of the iconic songs of the First World War came about. I mean, you've got the marching song like Mademoiselle from Armentières, I think, which many have heard the tune of, and many who are familiar with the First World War know that song.
That's right. And upon reaching Avonmouth, they boarded HM Transport Austerland for the sea voyage to France because they had to cross the English Channel, right? This leg of the journey wasn't without tragedy because on February 13th, 1915, the gentleman that we'd referred to earlier in the start of the podcast, Gunner William John Ball of the 9th Battery, Canadian Field Artillery, suffered a fatal accident aboard the ship. Basically, he sustained a fractured skull, which led to his untimely death. And it's a good example of how dangerous war is, not just from combat, from the mundane and seemingly routine activities of just trying to cross a ship that is battling a storm in the English Channel.
Yeah, exactly. And it, again, reinforces the fact that you can't control everything, and coming across weather, taking weather into account, I think things that we kind of forget nowadays, but still to this day play a very big role. So Gunner Ball was a veteran with over 13 years of prior service in the Royal Artillery. So he would have been a valuable addition to the force going across. And then he enlisted with the Canadian Field Artillery in 1914. And his death deeply affected his comrades. And let me just read a passage here from this day in RMR history, which reported on the events of Saturday, February 13th, 1915. The wind, which had sprung up the night before, increased to a gale by the morning of the 13th, whipped up by a wild cross sea, which pitched and rolled the boat to such an extent that few on board escaped severe seasickness. To add to the resulting discomfort, cold waves broke over the deck and poured onto the miserable men in the holds, while one of the horses, breaking loose from its stall, stumbled down an open hatch and crashed to its death on the deck below. No one was injured by the fall of this animal, but later a great wave broke over the ship, caught an artilleryman off guard on the upper deck, swept him along like a piece of matchwood, and killed him by dashing his head against an iron stanchion. Warned by this misfortune, all men who had occasion during the remainder of the day to move about on deck did so with extreme caution.
I can imagine extreme caution. And they were probably wearing hobnailed boots, which is metal. So metal studs in the bottom of your leather soles, metal on metal is not that grippy.
Not ideal.
Not that grippy. They'd have been
No,
sliding,
no.
especially wet, and they're not used to it. They're not sailors, right? They're
That's
soldiers. They
right.
have not a clue what they're doing. Yeah,
And
God.
just a little bit of interesting trivia on that as well, which I got from the notes that you provided, Colin, was the Australind was previously a German vessel, apparently, which was captured and then pressed into service by the Royal Navy. So
Continuing their long tradition of expanding their fleet by seizing capture.
who needs defense funding when you can just go
Just go get
capture
your own.
ships?
Go
Much
get
better.
your own.
Much better.
So the next day, on February 14th, which is also known for many of us as Valentine's Day, his body was committed to the sea, so anything but a romantic occasion. Canon Sylvestre, the Roman Catholic chaplain of the 14th Battalion, RMR, conducted the burial service, attended by members of Ball's artillery unit and the officers and soldiers of the RMR, who also paid their respects. It was a somber moment, reminding everyone of the risks and sacrifices even before reaching the battlefield.
Indeed. And then they arrived in France, at the port of Saint Nazaire, which was one of the major ports where a lot of troops were disembarked coming across the channel. And this was their first arrival on French soil, and it was here where they were issued with goatskin coats to combat the cold, an essential but, shall we say, pungent addition to their gear.
That's right, Rejoy. Let's take a deep dive into this rather mundane article of equipment, but it was something that would have been a large part of their lives. They didn't have all the good Gore-Tex kit that the troops have today, right? So taken again from this day in RMR history, quote, goat skin jackets were issued to British and Canadian troops in late 1914 and early 1915. Their use was reportedly a double-edged sword, as their warmth value was traded off against their attractiveness to fleas and lice. Given the miserable conditions of those winters, many soldiers preferred to itch and scratch rather than shiver and die of hypothermia. Not being worn next to the skin, they were relatively easy to treat with an anti-lice powder. When wet, they smelled terribly. There seemed to be in many patterns, some sleeveless jerkins and others full, half, and three-quarter length coats, but apparently no standardized pattern, which you think is kind of odd for a military.
Yeah.
Sheepskin and fur jackets were still being issued in the winter of 1916 and 1917. And many photos you can see, there's the soldiers wearing them, either leather or otherwise. And sometimes there's been a debate as to why you wouldn't turn it inside out and have the fleece or the fur on the inside to keep the warmth in, but apparently it's because the skins were of such poor quality. If they got wet, they would kind of fall apart and deteriorate. So that's why you put a skin on the inside. And apparently the fur was waterproof and would shed water naturally like it would properly. So according to Sergeant Harold Baldwin, 1st Division, Canadian Expeditionary Force, he's actually in the 5th Battalion, Western Cavalry from Saskatchewan, in his book, Holding the Line, he writes, the goatskin coats were a gift from the Tsar of Russia, and I'll insert, I've not been able to validate that anywhere. But never let facts get in the way of a good story.
No,
right there,
no.
Sergeant Baldwin. So I'll go back to his quote here. And they were supposed to have come from China. When we had donned our gift coats, there was perceptible murmur of comment running from the end to end of the ranks, caused by the odor from the presence of the Tsar, not unlike the presence of a skunk. The examination disclosed that the bloody, bracket, literally, close black bracket, coats were dotted in many places with the actual flesh of the deceased animals still sticking to them.
Food and clothing all in one. I mean, but even there, you can see how China was beginning its global trade domination. So it's coming from China. But speaking of that, I think I sense a business opportunity here, Colin. I mean, now 100 years later, I'm sure the quality of goatskins have improved. We could launch a goatskin military line. We can call it Canada Goat.
Well, and I live in Saint Henri, which was originally Saint Henri de Tannerie, which was all built on tanning hide. So maybe, there's a park right across from where I live that is dedicated to this. Maybe I could set up a little goat skin tanning business going on.
Exactly. Canada Goat, made in Canada. Great business opportunity.
The goat of goatskins.
The goat of goatskins. There we go. So after disembarkation, the troops boarded French trains. And if you thought the British trains were bad, wow.
I was shocked when I saw the pictures of how small they were.
Yes. All of a sudden, you're looking back nostalgically at the horrific train ride you had to the Avonmouth docks. But one of the things that the locals loved about the Armagh, which is well, it goes back to what you had mentioned earlier on, the fact that it's a bilingual unit. And when they discovered that the soldiers getting onto those trains actually spoke French, that went a long way to giving them a friendly reception. So the trains that we're talking about here, the French trains, just to give you an idea of how wonderful they are, they were marked 40 hommes, 8 chevaux. So 40 men, 8 horses. I nearly slipped into German there. I was about to say acht Pferden. But despite the cramped conditions and the insulting signage, the men kept up their sense of humor and they made the best of it in their camaraderie. So here's what was written in this day in our history regarding this. Servicemen in France were transported to the battlefront on a narrow gauge French railroads, the chemin de fer, inside boxcars, voitures, that were half the size of American boxcars. Each French boxcar was stenciled with a 40/8, denoting its capacity to hold either 40 men or 8 horses. This ignominious and uncomfortable mode of transportation was familiar to all who traveled from the coast to the war. The marches that followed, the train rides were grueling. The men carrying their 60-pound kits trudged along France's rock-hard pavé or cobblestone roads. The relentless pace and the weight of their gear took a toll, but the camaraderie among the soldiers kept them going, as it does to this day.
Yeah, I can't overemphasize how small those train cars are. I live right beside the train tracks, see trains all the time, and I'm always looking at those. Okay, 40 guys in there. That's not that bad, not that uncomfortable. And you see the pictures of the French ones; they're half the size. You're like, oh, that would be rather snug. Rather snug, especially with your gear. But speaking of forced marches, you and I have both completed our fair share of forced marches, and we've seen the damage that can be done by blisters. And it took me, it's showing how soft I am that I've been out of the forces. I got to blisters. I was hiking up Montmagnon back then in January with snowshoes and ripped up both heels, and it took a month for them to heal properly because that's how soft I've become. But the battalion history elaborated at the time, quote, the 2 features of the march are mentioned in many diaries and letters dealing with the time. On the march, the battalion suffered its first experience of the famous pavé or cobblestone roads of France. And the word suffered is used advisedly, for the pavé blistered the heels and toes to such an extent that many men were limping badly before the battalion reached its destination, end quote.
Indeed. I mean, to be fair, one must remember even when the British army first deployed to France and were marching up to the line, many soldiers also fell out, and that's the British Professional Army in those days, the BEF. So it's a hard slog. And as for blisters, my goodness, yes, I I think the one that sticks in my mind um, is your first experience of getting your combat boots and breaking them in. It is the worst week and a half that you will ever experience in your life, and your feet don't even. My feet didn't resemble my feet any longer. It was just sheer pain. You scream mentally in agony as you lace up those boots. But anyway, it's time to now move to our very popular Wish We Had a Sponsor segment. This episode of the Rum Ration Podcast is unofficially brought to you by Pusser's Rum, the only rum worth fighting for.
Distilled from a recipe older than most of the officers in Admiralty, Pusser's brings you the bold taste of naval tradition, minus the risk of flogging.
Distilled from a recipe. Oh, sorry, that's you. It's smooth, strong, and historically accurate. So raise a tot, lads, and toast to the days when real sailors drank their courage.
Pusser's Rum, because more stories sound better with a rum ration in hand. I'm starting to understand perhaps why they're not falling over themselves to sponsor us. Also,
I'm
it
shocked.
dawned on me that
I'm
we've never
shocked.
actually reached out to them. maybe we should make them aware.
Yes, show up on their radar.
Yeah.
So now we're going to talk about daily life on the move.
That's right. So, life goes on, right? Rations were simple. They ate tinned beef, hardtack, biscuits, and tea. Beer was also a welcome morale booster for the RMR, who were still allowed to drink it. The rum ration would come later as they made their way into the trenches. They still weren't getting the rum at this point. And the men of the 14th Battalion, according to this day in RMR history, were billeted in the villages or in the barns and outbuildings of neighboring farms. So they weren't living under canvas. They were just being billeted in people's accommodations and houses. Battalion headquarters were typically established in the chateau in any property, and an officer's mess would be set up in the village inn.
It's funny how you mentioned about them getting beer and they're still allowed to drink it. I'm presuming at this point that already they had decided that the Brits weren't allowed to drink it any longer, given their propensity for getting up to a little bit of excitement after a few
They weren't
pints.
alone in that.
No, not by a
As
long
I'm
shot.
getting ready for the 200th anniversary of the St. Patrick's Day parade in in Montreal today.
And also the key word there being still allowed to drink. But leisure activities were rare, but the men found time to sing, you heard there, share stories and write letters home. I mean, letters were a very important part of it. And while these letters were censored, they were a vital connection to the families and loved ones. And it's, we know even from the Second World War and up to today how important communication with your family is. Um, the delivery process was quite incredible. It took only 2 days for a letter to reach the front from London. The journey began at a purpose-built sorting depot at Regent's Park. By the war's end, 2 billion letters and 140 million parcels, if you can imagine that, had passed through it. From there, it was shipped to Le Havre, Boulogne, or Calais, where the Royal Engineers Postal Section, or the acronym REPS, very, very appropriate. The REPS section were tasked with getting it to the battlefields. They were staffed by, believe it or not, staffed by just 250 men in 1914. And by the end of the war, that increased to 4,000. So some interesting statistics regarding them. 12.5 million letters left the home depot every week. 19,000 mailbags crossed the channel every day. 134 ships carrying post were lost to the enemy. 375,000 letters, the equivalent of 4 tons, were censored each day at the height of the war.
Crazy.
555,000 mail sacks sent to France for Christmas 1917, which took 100 freight trains with trucks and 6,000 lorry loads or truckloads to North Americans to deliver to the field post offices. Incredible.
Crazy. It's a huge stats, eh? And the thing that you mentioned there about the 375,000 letters being censored each day at the height of the war, that wasn't being done by your reps crew. That was being done by the battalion officers and along the chain. And to add to their workload that they were doing, they had to, every letter that was going out, not every single one, but a bunch of them were being pulled out and spot checked and censored. And what a huge administrative work. That's those big numbers.
And, on top of a stressful and terrifying day in the trenches.
Exactly. I mean, wow. Imagine life before email and Amazon, eh? Religious service were also another cornerstone of daily life, with the chaplains providing spiritual support and leading prayers during the journey.
Indeed. And then, of course, there was that final approach to the front lines. As the RMR approached the front lines, I mean, that's where the reality of war really begins to set in. The distant rumble of artillery, and there are many stories. The war poets wrote about it. That's the one thing that seemed to stick in everybody's mind. You'd always hear that distant rumble of artillery in the distance, and that's a grim reminder of what's awaiting you as you make it up to the trenches. So, as reported in the RMR's official war history, no complaints were recorded, however, as during the march a low muttering, rumbling sound drifted back from some point far ahead. Unmistakably, it was the thunder of distant guns. Hearts leaped, and a shiver of excitement ran through the ranks. Who could complain of a blistered heel when guns were firing but a few miles over the horizon? Well, I could complain of a blistered heel.
You would.
I would, and I've been known to do it.
But even amid the tension that we've been building as we got closer and closer to the front, humor persisted. The goatskin coats, while effective at providing warmth, emitted such a strong odor, especially when wet, that led to jokes among the men that their smell alone might drive the enemy away.
I can well believe that. Quite pungent indeed. But by the end of their journey, imagine this: the Armor had endured long marches, harsh weather, and of course the weight of their equipment. Um, they've been forged into a fighting unit that will prove itself in the coming conflict over the years. Their resilience and unity were unshaken as they prepared to face the trials of trench warfare. So that wraps up part one of our Into the Trenches series. Next time, we're going to explore what life was like in the trenches, the mud, the rats, the dangers, the enduring spirit of the RMR, the soldiers, of course, who were using to represent all the Canadians that were in the First Division CEF.
Yeah, that's right. And I thought it was important for us to have this setting the stage because you mentioned the mud, the rats, and the dangers, and barbed wire and gas, and all those things that we typically associate with the trenches in World War One. But we forget about this rather mundane stuff. Like you shared some incredible statistics there about the mail, which is a huge part of their life. But there's so much other stuff that goes into that. I mean, just you think of get food, drinking
Yes.
water, all the kind of stuff that goes into it. There's a ton of details that go into that, right? Professionals, what is it? Amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics, right? So,
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
but for part two, to give everyone a taste of what to expect for our next episode, here's a quote from this day in RMR history. Quote, February 24th, 1915. Exactly 6 months after the battalion had left Montreal, arrangements were made for several platoons to undergo a short period of instruction in the front line. One diarist mentioned a great rivalry and wire pulling to be allowed to go with the first lot into the trenches. Officers and men being keen for the honor of accompanying those detachments of the regiment to come first under fire. End quote. Well, tune in to the next episode to see how keen they will still be after they were moved into the trenches. Spoiler alert, they were still pretty keen. So thanks for joining us on the Rum Ration Podcast. For more insights, photos, and personal stories, and some links to some really interesting resources that can help you out, please visit our website at rumration.ca.
Until next time, stay safe and keep the spirit alive.
Cheers to history.
Cheers to history.